Platformers and colorful characters are two staples of many childhoods, from Mario, Sonic the Hedgehog, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, and many, many more. These games have unique designs for the characters, whether it being the main hero themselves or the enemies. The color palette usually being bright and colorful, creative levels and settings throughout a few of these games, and music that can make any of us 90s or early 2000s kids weep with nostalgia. But while we all know the big battles between Sony, Nintendo, and Sega back then for their mainline games, there were a few select characters who existed in their games only to be remembered by some people, while with no massive support or fan outcry, were lost to time. Reluctantly, a lot of these games have come out of the woodwork and now into fully well done remasters, or even new games altogether, bringing new and old fans together to try out a new game or to relive a childhood favorite. There's a beauty to it all, but one game seemed to slip through the cracks, which I find funny due to how trending it was on its weekend release on Twitter, and the amount of fans rejoicing once these remasters were even unveiled.
We got it! Oh,
I'm of course talking about the wonderful and absolutely adorable game, Klonoa. So during what I would like to call a fever dream announcement at a Nintendo Direct, the trailer for Klonoa being ported to Switch and modern platforms was unveiled. It caused a huge shock for fans. Even though that Direct had many more titles to show, Klonoa was the one I recall being super excited for, and I nearly bought a Wii copy of the very first game when I was out game hunting a little while before this announcement. I never got the chance to play any of the games Bandai Namco made for the little guy, and barely even knew him aside from seeing a few art pieces and a Hat in Time mod of all things. But mark my words, when I did some research, I learned of several reviewers covering the game like Kadikarus, which only drove my desire to play these games higher and higher. I mean, look at the original game. It has this 2.5D approach to its game, and the PS1 visuals that are all pixely honestly have aged very well, and I mean pixely as a good thing, if that's a word. Klonoa Reverie series features both Klonoa Door to Phantomile and Lunateas Veil, two of the games where Klonoa apparently shined the best to a lot of reviewers, and today I'm going over both games and what I thought overall. There are other games that Klonoa had as well, such as Empire of Dreams, Dream Champ Tournament, and oh my god, this is the best game to ever exist. What were we talking about again? This is the very first game, but when they remastered it, they decided instead of using the PS1 version, they opted to use the Wii remake instead, which made the game look vastly different. While I think this version is fine, there was a certain charm in the original that is still kept preserved in its original copies. But both versions of Klonoa 1 look fantastic, and I would say the polish for the new version that they used for this game is even better. The intro cinematic is also beautifully remade, and shows Klonoa having a dream about a dark entity taking over his hometown of Breezegale. We meet Klonoa, the best boy, and his wonderful companion, only known as Hupao, and both of them are adorable. This is a 2.5D platformer, which is similar to that of many other PS1 games at the time, which personally I liked. Having the ability to play this game like this allowed a lot of creativity in game design. Most platformers let you double jump, and the same can be said about Klonoa, except there is a twist. Klonoa uses the ring shown in the intro with Hupao in it to inflate enemies into a balloon shape and jump on top of them for a second jump. This means enemy placement is a key part of the design philosophy for this game, which has you use enemies as secondary platforms to get to further to reach areas. You also get a flutter jump that you use by holding the jump button for a little bit, and it lets you stay airborne for just a few seconds. Before we continue, how are these enemies? In fact, I want to befriend all these little fellas. What's the red one called? They're called Moo? Klonoa really encourages exploration, and while at times you may think it's a 2D platformer, the fact it isn't allows you to look in the direction of not just left and right, but forward and backward. This lets Klonoa throw enemies he inflates into nearby objects to progress through the levels or unlock secrets. Throwing an enemy at an egg can unlock gems, which give lives like that of coins or Wumpa fruits. You can even get extra health, and even saving those who live in the respective level. Looking at the world in each level, I found myself unable to progress without saving everyone. It felt incomplete. I loved going out of my way to search levels and look for suitable hints towards new paths, and overall enjoying my time platforming away. The game also has you fight bosses, which most are easy, minus a select few which gave me some trouble. Some bosses have neat concepts, like this fight with Joka, who was the main villain's sidekick of sorts. Anyways, the fight first gave me a bit of trouble, but in hindsight, I absolutely love it. You have to throw various enemies at him with his two giant fists that spin around. The key is to throw it at the right time in the direction so the enemy that you throw does not get deflected by Joka's fists. The second part to his fight turns the stage into night, where you have to turn every platform back to its normal color by stepping on them, all while Joka attacks, and several moves try to stop you from turning the stage back to normal, as you can't damage his form here. The only way to continue the fight proper is by resetting the platform color so that it reverts Joka from being this weird eldritch horror to a funny round boy. Some bosses in this game are as simple as throwing an enemy point blank at something and doing damage, but I really do enjoy the fights where the games do get more creative and make you use all of what you've learned in the platforming segments. The same can also be said about the game's aforementioned platforming, though at times I feel like there is what I like to call PS1 jank in it. Certain jumps, especially on smaller platforms, feel a lot harder to land on, especially in the later levels. Combine this with enemy placement and it could be a recipe for disaster. The flutter jump, if tapped even slightly, can equal you not even having enough height to land on a certain platform. This happened to me a lot. My first playthrough of this game, I struggled to understand how to fully utilize Klonoa's rather complex kit. See what I mean? It's complex! The music and visuals found in this game are super cheerful and at times relaxing and somber, which I really gotta say. While not all the songs resonated with me, a lot did. Boss themes were cheerful somehow, but still tense enough to convey what was happening on screen. The level themes all match the settings very well, especially the first and last levels of the game. Each theme feels like an adventure, and while I think the second game easily has the better soundtrack, I cannot deny how good a majority of the tracks are in this game. Can we listen to that start jingle again, please? Haha, yeah, that's the best. The story for this game, to me, is a bit of a blur because I was so invested in the gameplay and hearing Klonoa's adorable voice, but for a game targeted for kids, it's rather somber. The overall plot is Klonoa and Wahoo stopping a villain who is trying to shroud the world in darkness and nightmares named gal.exe. He has a sidekick I mentioned earlier in a boss fight known as Joka, and causing havoc for every single kingdom in Phantomile. The only saving grace is a singing diva who is viewed highly in Phantomile, known as Lunateas, who can use the Song of Rebirth to go restore everything to as it was. Now, how somber does this story get? Well, let me explain. They show Klonoa having to mourn over his grandpa dying, and seeing the pain in his eyes actually made me tear up. Then the big bad named gal.exe and his whole plan to rule over Phantomile and make the world suffer in nightmares is all because the world casted him aside. His design and lower-pitched voice is not only intimidating, but is contrasted nicely with the one he makes do his dirty work, known as Joka, who has a much more higher-pitched voice and a much more friendly but still intimidating design. Both characters have abstract looks and cause many of the major plot points that occur in this game. Once Joka and gal.exe have been defeated, all of the important characters we meet throughout each kingdom of Phantomile help fight this giant shadowy being known as Nahatum. Nahatum is like one of the Moo shown earlier, but much more evil looking. The fight with them is quite something too, but honestly, not my favorite fight in the game despite the high stakes. And not to mention the ending, which sees Klonoa in a humanoid form of Wahoo, A little less adorable though, sitting on the grass, planning for the future and how excited Klonoa was to have a best friend like him. Yu-Pao told Klonoa that it was time for him to go back to where he originally came from. He proceeded to confess that he was responsible for bringing Klonoa into the world of Phantomile, and that the world that he lived in was all a dream, and every single moment they shared together was all just fake memories, so that Yu-Pao could use Klonoa to save Phantomile. Klonoa refused to believe this, but Yu-Pao said that he said it was true, and when Luffy sings a song of rebirth as mentioned, Klonoa will be pulled back to his world, into his Phantomile, not Yu-Pao's. Yeah, for a game, as I stated earlier, that was designed for kids, they really made this somber as all hell. It can be viewed as symbolic to a degree, but for me, I just remembered thinking I was going to jump straight into the second game that night, only to think about what I just witnessed. It was heavy. One last note before moving on, Klonoa 1 has a secret extra level called Baloo's Tower, where we meet Baloo again, who was in the first level, and he was crafting a tower for the singing diva Lunateas. This level requires use of all platforming knowledge you have obtained throughout the game, some skill, and a lot of determination. I enjoyed the later sections of the game, but this was such a challenging but fun time overall to go for. It feels like this was a last-minute passion project thrown in by the devs just to test players' skills. Once completing it, Baloo does confess his love to Lunateas. I mean, he built an entire tower, but it's only for him to get rejected due to him being too old. Ouch. But we get a cool music player to use. Even though some of the levels in this game, especially later on, can be challenging, it can be really fun and endearing, especially if you're trying to look for all collectibles. I still viewed this as a very comfy game experience regardless, and there's a lot of quality of life changes, such as an easy mode that gives you infinite lives, and it lets you go ahead and experience the game a little more casually, but I still preferred playing it on normal mode regardless, except for that tower. I needed those infinite lives. It really nailed the 2.5D approach to platforming, and honestly, this game has aged very nicely, and I would honestly look for a PlayStation 1 copy just to experience the original. Now we get to what many consider is one of the best Klonoa games. Although let's be real guys, they already made perfection here with Klonoa Beach Volleyball. I have never played it. Klonoa Lunateas Veil was a PS2 game and hailed as a PS2 great by some, and scored very high reviews for the time. I remember seeing this game at retro game stores while collecting and seeing the scary price tag on this thing. Truly a collectible if you can find it physically. If we compare the original Door to Phantomile to this game, the upgrade in visuals is already noticeable, and Klonoa himself garnered a slight redesign, as well as keeping the tried and true Pac-Man cap he always is wearing, except for when he snoozes. The intro shows us this scene where a dream voice calls out to Klonoa as he's falling into the sky. He lands on an island where playing with two characters we've never met talk about who he is and what his ambitions might be. And then they just kind of fly off. Bit of a Kingdom Hearts vibe this game's intro is giving me, not gonna lie. It reminds me of the whole End of Destiny Island segment from the first game. I mean, this first level is also a lot more dreary, and the story is actually a focal point already at the very beginning, rather than it being...
Hey, you're finally awake.
We then meet two of the new characters, a priestess in training known as Lolo, and her adorable friend Popka, who's, I think they're a dog, but they're still adorable. Like with Yupao, Lolo being a priestess in training is now the one to help Klonoa and go inside the ring to do what Yupao did. One little thing of note that could relate to most of the Klonoa games thus far is I noticed that they refer to him as the Dream Traveler. And I think I want to go ahead and go more in depth on that a little bit later. The gameplay of Klonoa 2 feels refreshing, but also at the same time not losing its roots in the 2.5D space that the first game defined. One thing I noticed in the first game was the stages were short, despite maybe a few later stages that felt a little longer. But here, each level feels fleshed out at the gate. Dynamic scene switching from section to section where we see Klonoa flying mid-air, almost similar to the stage dynamics in 3D Sonic games. It feels almost like a 3D game with the level of polish going on. The stages being longer also means more creative use of the enemy placement, making you collect dolls for a circus runner named Mamet. Doing so unlocks two hidden levels which, much like the last game, are tough as nails. These levels are aptly named the Chamber o' Fun and the Chamber o' Horrors, much like the extra vision in Door to Phantomile, but difficulty curve from normal levels to these is noticeable. But let's not veer off too much, shall we? The variety in stages here is also upgraded. A circus-themed stage filled with a night sky and bright light shining throughout, a snowboarding stage where you're using a board to surf through the snowy mountains, and even going onto an ancient boat navigating through the inside and trying to activate it again. I found myself loving the designs of each stage that I went on, and feel like the scale and quality went up in ideas comparatively to Phantomile. Lunatea is a much more varied world, and it shows. They even have a proper world map, which makes traversing throughout Lunatea a lot less cluttered than the book that was used beforehand. And with the story being more in the forefront, I found Klonoa as a character that much more engaging and downright adorable. Character development. Each level in Klonoa 2 felt refined as mentioned, but a specific level in mind really jumped out to me. As a kid, I read stories, and one of them was Goodnight Moon, a pop-up book that included puppets that was a general story of helping toddlers and younger kids go to sleep. It was a hidden memory for me, but this level in question legitimately unlocked it. Enter the Maze of Memories. This level is found in the castle of the kingdom of Mira Mira. This area is inhabited by rabbit-like creatures called Mira Mirans who relive their past, which factors into the comparison earlier. The Maze of Memory is filled with mirrors and various artwork that shows off things of more than likely what the Mira Mirans did in their past. The Mira Mirans as well look like rabbits, similar to the rabbit in Goodnight Moon. This level made me genuinely enjoy the game that much more, with it being designed so uniquely, featuring MC Escher-like staircases in the background and checkered floors scattered about the place. The music here is also very nostalgic sounding, reminding me of something I would hear on one of those I Spy shows with the bizarre 3D art taking place in a white museum. Everything in this level felt so unique and charming, and it took me down a nostalgic ride, and I just replayed it right after just to really soak in the atmosphere. It's also the same theme from an earlier Klonoa game known as Klonoa Moonlight Museum, released in 1999 on the Bandai WonderSwan. Basically a Game Boy of sorts, but made by Bandai Namco. This was a fully 2D game released 2 years after Door to Phantomile, but takes place before the game. It has Klonoa going through a new world with Yupao entering a museum filled with stolen art. Point being, this game was interesting in its concept, but the theme it uses is the exact same as the one we hear in Maze of Memories. such a cool nod to Klonoa Moonlight Memories, but on a story standpoint, it almost connects and views Maze of Memories as a sort of new version of that museum. The artwork and dreamlike way the world looks like makes it seem that way too, but there's just something oddly compelling about this level, and I just wanted to go ahead and ramble about it. The rest of Lunatea's Vale is fantastic as you replay a lot of the same levels under different circumstances, but honestly, I love how different each level feels from the second time around. Areas you once saw nearly taken apart by machinery or toxins left alone actually maintain that disarray at the end, and the villain's actions do affect these second run-throughs a lot. I found myself seeing these levels as something entirely new, and enjoyed the platforming segments way more here, as they got more fun, but a bit challenging. Going for secrets is something I still enjoyed doing too. Each Mommet doll was hidden well, but not too hidden to where I was worried if I missed one once in a while. Plus, we have two of our villains, who are known as Leorina and Tat, who we saw at the very start of the game on the airplane. Both characters look very cool in their design, especially Tat being a black and white cat ripped from a childhood storybook almost. While I might say they are villains, they really are just antagonists who make the journey for Klonoa, Lolo, and Popka just a little bit harder. Though they add some of the most interesting boss fights in the game, so fair trade. One of my favorite segments of Klonoa 2 was the Kingdom of Sorrow. After befriending Leorina after a fight where she nearly lost her way, to put things bluntly, she informs Klonoa and friends of one thing to help restore balance to Lunatea, which is to defeat the King of Sorrow. This level is almost empty as it is isolated from the rest of the kingdoms in the game, and while you might assume it as this dark and rainy, desolate world, it's in fact bright while the sun is seemingly setting. Out of all the levels, this last level has the most entertaining platforming sections and by far the second best music in the entire game. Traces of various music from Door to Phantomile can be heard throughout the soundtrack of the level in Kingdom of Sorrow. Grandpa's Theme, Windmill Song, and Song of Rebirth are some of the songs briefly heard in the music. Each song that has a motif played is oddly super important to the first game and highlight pivotal moments that occur for Klonoa. Between both games, the last level's themes oddly aren't super energetic aside from the very last part of Door to Phantomile. Due to these games having rather emotional stories, I think the music makes more sense to be this way. Sorrow is isolated for a reason though. Think of any emotion we really want to escape from and forget exists at times. I can view each of these kingdoms found within Lunatea as various emotions. Jubilant for being jovial and exciting, Maze of Memories for highlighting nostalgic and sentimental feelings, while the Kingdom of Sorrow highlights sadness. What's interesting about this is the king himself looks reminiscent of Klonoa and is a rather soft-spoken person and filled with bitterness towards Lunatea for choosing to ignore them. Giving personality to an emotion is something a lot of media does, but for a PS2 game designed for children in the early 2000s, I found this character quite impactful. A much more emotionally driven fight between Klonoa and the king starts, but you can almost tell the king didn't want to even fight in the first place, almost similar to Crossbreed Priscilla from Dark Souls, but desperation for people to accept sorrow leads him to resort to violence against Klonoa. The king suffered a mental breakdown, isolating himself in a force field and attacking Klonoa again and again. But you know how this works. Ultimately, the King of Sorrow was beaten. Defeated, he begged Klonoa to help him. Klonoa agreed and rang the Bell of Sorrow, restoring the power of sorrow. As the king lay dying in his arms, Klonoa reassured him that he no longer has to be afraid, and that sorrow would not be forgotten again. The king was finally able to be at peace and evaporated in Klonoa's arms. It's tragic. The voice we heard in the beginning of the game was the king begging Lunatea to remember him and to not be forgotten, which is the purpose of Klonoa even being here. The King of Sorrow was trying to lift Lunatea's veil and make others pay attention to the emotion that is sorrow. Each bell that Klonoa has went and rung with these orbs have all been mentioning certain emotions. There are a total of 5, being tranquility, joy, discord, indecision, and sorrow. Leorina also used to be a priestess similar to Lolo, but with her emotions in disarray led to her freeing this lost kingdom. Similar to Hupao, the king used Klonoa to search for these orbs he's after in the game as a false helper known as Baguji, whom started Klonoa on this journey with Lolo and Popka. Fast forward a bit through the story and we enter the final cutscene. Unlike Door to Phantomile, Klonoa has to say farewell to his newfound friends in this somber scene. But this time, Klonoa is aware of this goodbye, and is the one to help console Willow, who didn't want him to go or the adventure to even end. It's like saying goodbye to an old friend moving away as a kid, and while this scene is far less tragic than the first game, it still left a pretty emotional impact. Wrapping up the second game, we see a dream ring falling down, and it says a text that says good morning along with your player name, but for this case we'll just go ahead and say good morning Klonoa. Klonoa 2 and by extension Klonoa 1 are dreams that Klonoa either has or is entering. Each level, no matter how jovial and exciting it might be, much like the first game, they both have moments, and even a whole atmosphere the second time around that is entirely different and coated with this somber painting knowing it's all a dream. And witnessing Klonoa experience that, and that he has to wake up to his home in reality, really lets this game, and any other game that Klonoa is in, feel so whimsical, which makes it even harder to want to wake him up. It lets the music in these games both be upbeat but somber and real at times, and it lets these moments break players' hearts the first time around, much like when you have a great dream, only for the rug to be pulled out from under you and you have to turn off an alarm clock. Klonoa is a dream traveler, and between the first game and the second game, we see him have to leave these worlds like Phantomile and Lunatea. He's just traversing from dream to dream with the power of that ring we see all too often. It's symbolic, honestly, and despite being a kid's game, I find the concept of finding escapism in a dream kinda meta as well, given the fact that video games give people that same feeling. But that's just food for thought.